For 30 years he listened to patients who woke up after surgery and told him about the tunnel, the light, the deceased relatives who came to meet them. And for 30 years he gave them the same calm, professional explanation. It's just the brain. Lack of oxygen, disorientation, nothing more. Dr. Rajiv Parti was the chief anesthesiologist at a cardiac hospital in Bakersfield, California, a man who knew better than almost anyone what happens to the body at the moment of death, and who didn't believe a single word of what his patients told him until Christmas 2010, until the night he found himself on the operating table and saw exactly what he had spent 30 years explaining away as illusion. Stay with me, because one detail of this story, the detail that no neurology can explain, will permanently change how you think about what happens when a person dies. Rajiv Parti grew up in India, in a home where his father ruled through fear and love had to be earned through results. From childhood, he carried one belief that shaped everything that followed. If you're not the best, you're nothing. He went to America, completed medical school, built a career, then a house, then a bigger house, then cars worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. On the outside, the American dream. On the inside, as he later admitted, he was driven by one question he asked himself with every person he met: what can I get from this person? With patients he was effective and cold. With staff, demanding without a trace of empathy. With his own son, he repeated exactly what he had learned from his own father, shouting instead of conversation, punishment instead of support. He knew what he was doing, and he kept doing it, because he didn't know any other way to be a father. In 2005, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, surgery, complications, another surgery. For 5 years, his body slowly broke down under the weight of the disease, and the treatment meant to save him. And in December 2010, a post-operative infection turned into sepsis. His fever spiked to a level where the body simply begins to lose. On Christmas Eve, on an operating table, the doctor who had anesthetized hundreds of other people lost consciousness himself, not knowing whether he would wake up. What he described afterward began with the cold clinical precision you would expect from someone who had spent 30 years looking at the human body as a machine. He was floating near the ceiling of the operating room. He saw his own body lying on the table, pale, connected to cables and monitors. He saw every movement of the doctors working on him. He heard every word, including a joke one of the surgeons told during the procedure, at a moment when the patient, meaning him, was by every medical indicator deeply unconscious. After waking up, Rajiv repeated that joke, word for word. The surgical team froze, but that was only the beginning. Without transition, without warning, his consciousness moved thousands of miles away, to India, to the living room of his sister's home in New Delhi. He saw her and her husband preparing the evening meal. He heard their conversation. He knew what time it was on that side of the world. When he called his sister after waking up and described what he had seen, she confirmed every detail. The dishes on the table, the words she had spoken, the exact time. 5,000 kilometers from the operating room in Los Angeles. And it was then, as he said afterward, that he understood for the first time this was not a dream and not a fever hallucination. Something in him had genuinely been outside his body, and he had no control over what would happen next. What happened next was something his 30 years of medical experience had no framework for at all. The light disappeared not gradually, instantly, sharply, as if someone had flipped a switch. The darkness that swallowed him was thick, almost physical. With it came sounds, moaning, wailing, screams of pain so deep that the sound itself felt like a form of torture. He felt a smell he described as something between burning flesh and sulfur, all pervasive, impossible to ignore. This place was filled with suffering that had long since stopped even searching for an end, as if the beings trapped there no longer believed things could be any different. And then, in that darkness, Rajiv saw himself, not metaphorically, literally, every moment of his life when he had treated another person as a tool or an obstacle, every patient he had looked at as a medical case rather than a human being, every member of staff he had crushed with words because they stood lower in the hospital hierarchy, and most painfully, every moment when his son had come to him with something important to say. And he, too busy, too irritated, had sent him away without a word. Rajiv said afterward that in that moment he understood something that changed his definition of hell forever. Hell is not a place someone throws you into as punishment. Hell is being forced to see yourself clearly, without any possibility of looking away, without the justifications you surrounded yourself with your entire life. Everything he had accumulated, the house, the cars, the status, in that place turned out to be exactly what it was: nothing. The darkness was closing in tighter. In desperation, he called out for help. He heard footsteps. Out of the darkness emerged a figure he recognized instantly, despite the fact that more than 20 years had passed since his death. His father. But not the father he remembered, stern, cold, terrifying by his mere presence in a room. This man looked younger than in any memory his son held, and in his eyes was something Rajiv had never seen there. Peace. Not the peace of a man in control of the situation, the peace of someone who had finally understood where he had been going wrong his entire life. His father said only 2 words: "Come with me," and led him out of the darkness. Walking beside him, Rajiv felt something he had never felt in this man's presence while he was alive: the absence of judgment. The father who had been a source of fear for decades was now simply walking beside him, without demands, without conditions, without requirements. And in that moment, Rajiv understood something that overturned his entire understanding of his own family history. His father had loved him his whole life. He simply never knew how to show it, because he himself had received from his own father only fear, and had never seen anything else. The violence Rajiv had experienced as a child was not an act of malice. It was an unhealed wound passed down from generation to generation, like a disease no one had ever tried to cure. In that moment, Rajiv forgave him, completely, without remainder, without conditions. His father led him to the entrance of a tunnel filled with a light Rajiv had never seen before. A brightness he later described as the light of 1,000 suns, and yet not blinding, not tiring to the eyes, something that received you, surrounded you. At the threshold of the tunnel, his father stopped, gave a single nod and stepped back, as if his role as guide had just been completed. On the other side stood 2 luminous figures: Rajiv, raised in Hinduism, a physician who throughout his career had treated faith as an entirely private matter, recognized them without hesitation, without explanation, as if this knowledge had always been inside him. Archangel Michael and Archangel Raphael stood on a meadow covered in flowers that glowed with their own inner light. The air was dense with something he could only call love in its pure form, not a feeling, but something more physical, a substance that entered him with every breath and made him lighter. They spoke to him without words, directly into his consciousness. They told him that what he had just been through was not punishment. It was a mirror, and he had been able to walk out of that darkness only because within it, within the darkness itself, he had found remorse and the will to change. They showed him a review of his entire life, and then something he hadn't expected. Fragments of previous lives, each casting different light on the patterns he had struggled with in this one, his need for control, his sense of superiority, the chain of generational violence he had been repeating his entire life without noticing. And then they gave him a task. They told him he had to go back. That the healing of a human being doesn't begin in the body. It begins in consciousness, in forgiveness, in the decision to look at every person you encounter as someone worthy of care rather than as a means to an end. Rajiv didn't want to go back. He said later that this place was everything a human being unconsciously searches for their entire life and cannot name until they feel it themselves. But he knew he had no choice. He woke up in the recovery room. The first thing he felt was not pain. It was a strange dissonance, as if he had returned to a body that no longer fit him, like an old coat. The doctors told him he had been very lucky. Sepsis with that level of fever usually ends in death or permanent organ damage. Rajiv listened to these words, and was thinking about something else entirely. About the father who had pulled him out of the darkness, about the two luminous figures on the meadow, and about one question he had asked every person he met for the last 30 years of his life: what can I get from this person? Now he knew there was only one question that made any sense. What can I do for this person? In the months that followed, Dr. Rajiv Parti gave away most of his wealth. He sold his mansion. He resigned from his prestigious position as chief of anesthesiology. He opened a small clinic where he began treating chronic pain and addiction through methods based on mindfulness and forgiveness, things he said he had learned on the other side. And for the first time in his life, he asked his son for forgiveness. Raymond Moody, the psychiatrist who first scientifically described the phenomenon of near-death experiences and who spent half a century studying hundreds of such accounts, wrote later that the story of Rajiv Parti was one of the most complete and astonishing he had ever heard, and that it moved him even after decades of conducting this kind of research. There is something in this story that goes beyond its extraordinary nature. Rajiv Parti spent 30 years of his professional life listening to patients describe exactly what he himself experienced. And for 30 years, he explained to them with a polite smile that their brain was simply malfunctioning under stress. And when he found himself at that boundary, he saw exactly what he had spent his life trying to explain scientifically, and understood that none of those explanations had ever been enough. Write in the comments, what struck you most about this story? The moment with his sister in India, the father who led him out of the darkness, or the fact that a man who spent 30 years denying this experience ended up in exactly the same place as every patient he had refused to believe.